Hello and welcome back, and it's time for another Plex Media Server test, and today we are looking at the QNAP TS-453E. This is their brand new 4-bay desktop solution, Intel powered, one of the newer generation Celeron processors with onboard embedded graphics. And in today's video we're going to be running a bunch of our usual tests to see just how well this system can perform. We're going to be looking at 4K, looking at HD, HEVC, H.264, we're going to be looking at different frame rates, and we're going to see just how well this NAS can cope. But a few disclaimers as normal. If you've already followed this series before, there's going to be a little bit of repetition. I do make these videos so that anyone coming towards them doesn't need to have watched the other. I believe must be getting close to 80 or 90 tests by now. So there will be an element of repetition. First and foremost, there is of course that background here. So I am conducting this utilizing capture on a laptop, so you can hear the fans on this GPU equipped laptop. They're spinning up in the background, and although during the course of today's testing we're going to be predominantly looking at just how well the NAS is handling stuff as we're playing the files, you will see spikes appearing on my own internal system utilization. Don't worry, it by no means causes a bottleneck. You just start to hear either the embedded graphics during the smaller processes or the GPU fans kick in. It never hits 100%, so don't worry, the laptop doesn't form any kind of bottleneck. Next, you can see here from the top, we are accessing this on a 192.168.1.103 IP. We're accessing it locally over the network there. Now, a number of you might be wondering what it's going to be like to access a Plex Media server on this NAS remotely via the internet. And in order to simulate those conditions, we will be utilizing an element of transcoding. And I will be talking about later on why we use transcoding and how that has an impact. Next, I want to talk about the hardware architecture of this system. It is a Celeron-based processor there, which means that pretty much 1080p is going to be absolutely fine, but it's 4K where we might see something of a hurdle. And this system has 8GB of DDR4 memory, which is the default for this NAS. We've already set the system up. We've already got our test files that we already use for all the other tests, and on the right hand side of the screen there we have got our performance measurements coming from the dashboard tool of Plex. You can see there the green line there is Plex Media Server, and the red line is the overall system. So the other thing to take from this, if you do go for this NAS as your Plex Media Server system, that when we're doing this, you have to make sure there is some system resources left over, otherwise your NAS just isn't going to run. We're recording this in OBS, as you can see here on screen, so hopefully that won't cause too much of friction with regards to some of the playback there. Also, we mute all of the files because of YouTube's rules on monetization and copyright. And finally, as we run through our tests, the things you need to look at is CPU and RAM. You don't need to worry too much about bandwidth, because when it comes to bandwidth, that's kind of network connectivity, and it's not really going to be an issue on this 2.5 GBE system. So again, what we're looking at predominantly is CPU and RAM, and even then, majority of the time, we're going to be looking at that CPU. But just to give you some idea of what we're talking about, we're going to go ahead and play quite a low rent file there. I'm just going to go ahead and play the Matrix. It's a 720p H.264 file. I'm going to go ahead and play that there on the left hand side of the screen, and we'll see the impact of that here on the right hand side during the CPU utilization there. So while we're accessing this over local area network, this is a pretty small file to play. We could probably play lots of different versions of this file simultaneously via Plex Media Server, and while I think of it, it's also worth highlighting we do have a Plex Pass enabled on this account, and we're utilizing full transcoder abilities there, and again that will make a lot more sense later on when I explain. So what we can do is we can go ahead and skip around the file, and even though we're accessing a file remotely via the network, we're able to skip around very, very easily to different areas of this film. Currently playing in original quality there, you can see, and with absolutely no difficulties, and the CPU and the memory not really doing anything for us to be concerned with. Now, this will change the minute we start introducing transcoding. Now, what transcoding is, for those that aren't aware, is when a file is changed in its format, in its picture quality, in its frame rate, in order to be better suited to a new environment. Case in point, You may own a 4K copy of the latest Marvel movie, and it's great to have that on your big OLED TV at home. But what if you're accessing it on a mobile phone on a train to work? You don't need some 26, 50 gigabyte file streamed. You want a much smaller version for a smaller screen and a limited bandwidth. And that's where transcoding kicks in. It reshapes a file to be more better suited to the destination device. And that is where we're going to be simulating more limited conditions. And we're going to show what happens when you convert on the fly. That is, when we make the system change a file on demand for us to be able to see easily how the system copes. So what we're going to do is we're going to select a 480p 1.5 megabytes per second transition there. And as you can see, it was instantaneous. There's been no impact there on the CPU utilization. We're running, as you can see now, on a converted 480p 1.5 megabits per second file. We can still skip around with zero delay happening there. So now what we can do is take things a little lower. Why don't we go down now to 240p? And this is where things are going to start getting a bit intensive. You can already see the picture quality of the file we're accessing has dropped there because it's 240p rather than the 720 that we were running originally. And on the other side of the screen, we're starting to see a small bump in CPU utilization, but still very, very small difference there and not really any concern whatsoever. And we can skip around on the file, tiniest delay, as the NAS starts to adapt that file on the fly there for us. And finally, what we can do is really push our bandwidth and go down to a 160p file there. And this will be the smallest, and this will be one of the most challenging things that we can do with this one file. And again, we're running on potato quality. We're seeing the CPU utilization there get higher in line with the more demanding tasks we're doing. Remember, this is happening on the fly. We could have offline transcoded where the file is changed in advance, but again, still running it absolutely fine there. And for me, that's a great success for this NAS and that CPU. So now we try our next file. This is a 1080p file, H.264, a little denser, higher bit rate there. And we can go ahead and play that file immediately there within Plex Media Server, and it will run absolutely fine. Again, we can skip around, we can go back and forward. The file's running absolutely fine there, accidentally pausing it. We can bring open the original settings there, and as you can see, the original picture quality running at 1080p, running absolutely fine there, and we're doing well. So what we can do is zoom out, click down, and this time we're going to cut down to 720p. So now we cut down, again, absolutely fine. Again, skip around, running absolutely fine. Right inside of the screen, absolutely fine. Tiniest little increase there, but this is where we're going to start to see some work. Because the minute we start going to these lower qualities from 1080p, we're starting to change some of the kind of native conversion. So rather than go for that one there, we're going to go down to a 480p now. And at 480p is when we're going to start to see those delays get a little bit bigger there. It's still a very fast transcode for us. And again, we're going to talk about this dark orange area of the bar later on. But for now, we can see CPU utilization still very, very low and good. We can skip around. Slight delay, again, something we're used to at this level. And if we look at the utilization, we can see the GPU has not had to step in. We can also see that graphics utilization on my local machine is still doing absolutely fine, and that won't be a problem as the video continues. From there, we can go ahead and start going down, and this time we'll go down to a very awkward and very rarely used transcode 328. Now, this generally proves quite a problem for a lot of systems. Moving forward from there, we can make our way down to the 240p mark. And again, we're running on this CPU, which is still a Celeron quad-core, kind of a Prosumer grade server CPU. We can see that CPU utilization creeping slightly there. And we're still just living there at 10%. And as soon as it gets the job started, it goes down to 3% quite easily there. And again, final transition, we'll go down to a 160p file. We're seeing the delay, we're seeing potato quality there as expected, and on the right hand side of the screen we're seeing that rise there. We're up to 13% there, still absolutely fine. And if the majority of your media is H.264 older media at 1080p or even early 4K, which we'll talk about later on, you should be absolutely fine there. So overall, some great transitions there. Now, this is where we move on to the more advanced system files here. Now, by that, we're going to be taking advantage of the Jellyfish files. Now, for those that aren't aware, the Jellyfish files are a series of files. The original website doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but we have managed to recreate that database over on NAS Compares. Hopefully that's linked in the description, which has all of these test files ready to go with. Why are they so significant? Well, because, and if we play one real quick, I'll show you, it is a 30-second clip of a bunch of jellyfish. So, big whoop. Why is that important? Well, in order to fairly test any system for Plex, what we want is the same file in a multitude of different formats, scales, resolution, frame rates, and more. And that's exactly what we get with the Jellyfish files. As you can see, this one is a 3 megabit file running at 1080p or HD. There, and it's an H.264 file. Indeed, when the file ends, you can see the format there is HD or 1080p and an H.264 file. Now, as we go through this list, and we won't go through all of them, just preset ones, we're able to see that that format changes. It's still 30 seconds, but it goes from 3 to 10 to 30 to 100, all the way up to 400 megabits per second frame rate. On top of that, the picture quality upscales from HD soon into 4K Ultra HD. And finally, we see H.264 become HEVC and HEVC 10-bit. Now, these are quite important. H.264 is an older compression technique. The compression technique is what helps a movie that you watch in the cinema be playable from your sofa. Now, H.264 is comparatively open source as far as a license is, and pretty much all devices can play it. But HEVC is a newer form of compression released over the last few years, and it's a shared patent, and therefore licensing for this on most client devices, so again, not so much the NAS, but the devices you are watching it on, is more complex. And a lot of the time, a device you buy will not have that license, forcing you to convert this file, much like we've done with transcoding up to this point, on the fly. And these bigger files require a lot more hardware in order to convert them. HEVC, otherwise known as highly efficient video codec, or H.265, is what a lot more modern grade multimedia arrives with. And if you are utilizing devices such as modern drones and modern cameras that record in 4K, chances are they record in HEVC as well, due to its advanced compression technique. And finally, 10-bit means it's an HDR version. So overall, these three files being 30 seconds long, although all three are 30 seconds long and all of them are about 10 megabytes in size, the result of the system playing them differs. We've just played this file here, but here's what happens when we play the same file in HEVC. We play it there, open up the format, and immediately you can see it's not playing the original quality. It's converting because of that HEVC license we talked about. Additionally, we can see that CPU spiked. It's had to because of the conversion technique, but it still managed to play the whole file. If we come out of that file, we'll then play the HDR version. Remember, we'll open this up. There's the conversion happening, and there is that HEVC playback, and here is the HDR version. And as you can see, it used more resources to play the HDR version comparatively. And that's the big thing when it comes to playing the Jellyfish files. It gives us a means to track where our system, where its heights are playing picture quality files. The other things I'll add is most files we watch commercially in the home, or even if we buy at retail, generally live here in the middle when it comes to frame rate. And if you're watching 4K, you don't really ever hit these bottom 5 or 6 file types at 4K unless you are buying exceedingly big media. To put that into perspective, if we go into File Station and go into our test files and list by size, and we scroll in and have a look, we can see that the files at the bottom, those 3 megabytes per second, are 10 megabytes in size, but as we get to the bigger file types like those 4K ones, that same 30-second file is 1.4 gigabytes. That would be 2.8 gigabytes of data per minute, and the average movie is 90 to 120 minutes long. Think how big that file's going to be, and think about the biggest file in your movie collection, and it'll give you some idea how little or indeed none at all the media is in your home that is actually this big. We only include them in the tests as a means of measuring the performance of our NAS, and to date, to my knowledge at least in all of my testing, only around 3 NASs have played these top files in any way fluidly. So, now you understand H.264, HEVC, and HDR media, we can start going through these files. So the first thing we're going to do is play all of the H.264 files. The reason being, these are the ones that the NAS will struggle with the least. We've already played the first one, so now we're going to play a 10 megabits per second H.264 file. We'll open up the monitor there at the bottom. It's running fine. That dark orange line has filled. Again, we will talk about that later on. OBS is running absolutely fine there in the background, and our performance monitor is still doing absolutely fine. Everything's running well, and the CPU utilization, it hasn't changed in any meaningful way. Now we'll scale up to a 30 megabits per second frame rate version. Again, still 1080p, still playing in the original quality, and on the right hand side we're seeing a small bump, but not really anything to be overly concerned with. We can come out of that. Now we're going to go for a 100 megabits per second file, and this is our last H.264 1080p file. If we open it up, we can see playing in original quality, and now we're starting to see that CPU spike become a little bit more noticeable, but also we're seeing that dark orange line start to meet that of the playback line. Now, if you've ever watched a video on YouTube, which of course you have because you're watching this, you'll know about buffering. And what that means is an area of the video has been stored and lined up in order to facilitate that playback. Now, a lot of the time, the breaking point of NASs when it comes to Plex Media Server is that the system cannot encode the file and line it up for playback quicker than organic playback. In other words, it's taking more than 1 second to prepare 1 second of footage. So we can already start to see we're starting to hit the potential breaking point in Plex Media Server. Now we're going to try a 120 megabits per second 4K file. This file is huge. So we'll go there. This is when our files start to arrive at 700 megabytes to 1 gigabyte. We can open it up there. It's trying to play back the original. We can see the CPU spike, but now we've just seen it go down. We've also seen that the dark orange has stopped. That means this system is overworked in trying to play this file, and therefore it's shortly going to kick us out. When it does that, we'll have to try transcoding this file on the fly. But right now, playback is looking all but impossible. So this time, we're going to play back that file, but this time we're going to get the system to suggest an encoded version for us. And now it's running at 189 megabits per second in 4K. If we go to the bottom, we can now see that that encoding and buffering is taking place, and we're up to 8 seconds. However, even now, I'm not convinced that playback, if it is going to work, will be able to stay behind the transcoding there. And right now, even the automatic recommended transcoding isn't helping. So what if we cut down even further? We go down to 1080p at 20 frames per second. In other words, we've changed our 4K file back to HD. Now it's absolutely fine. But that still doesn't mean it passed that test. We were looking to play 4K. And finally, we're going to play the 200 megabits per second version in H.264. Again, if it didn't play the previous one, I can't see it doing a tremendously great job playing this one. Once again, I've mentioned this before and I'll say this again. The file types we're playing here, particularly the last 5 or 6 in that list, do not represent most modern media, and indeed a very, very small percentage of users are ever going to have that kind of storage media afforded to them. The key thing is to look at the multimedia types you own to see how much of it is H.265, how much of it is 4K UHD, and if it is 4K UHD, what the frame rate is. So for now, we're going to switch over to the HEVC files, and we're going to go down to our 10 megabits per second test file there. We're going to open that up, and this is where you're going to start to see two things. You're going to start to see that dark orange bar not fill up quite as fast, but you're also going to start to see the CPU utilization start to noticeably creep up overall in order to get the job done. Obviously, we're also seeing that conversion happening thanks to the HEVC automatic change there due to a lack of license. Next, we can go to a 30 megabits per second HEVC file. So again, we're up to 10 times the density of that first file we played. The dark orange line is not quite staying ahead as much as it did before, and CPU utilization is once again spiking intermittently as it attempts to play this file for us here. But again, we've got the dark orange line and it would still play this file suitably. Now we move to 100 megabits per second 1080p file, a tremendously huge file here. Once again, we'll have a look. Our dark orange line going slower than before, and here's going to be interesting to see if it can still stay ahead of the darker orange line can stay ahead of playback. It looks to me like it's going to be absolutely fine, and therefore I would certainly recommend any kind of 1080p live transcoding requirements on this system. Natively, even better on H.264 there. So we'll come out of there. Now we go into our 4K files. Now bear in mind, for the last time, these are not files like normal files. These are tremendously dense. The 120 megabits per second 4K Ultra HD HEVC 10-bit HDR file, man alive, that's a lot of words. Again, if we go to there, we can see that file is tremendously huge. It's half a gig in scale. So let's play that file now. Wrong one. Let's play that file there. Zoom out. Open up the bar. And again, we're seeing that dark orange line. It's reached 7 seconds, but will it go further? I'm not convinced it will. We're seeing those spikes. We're not seeing it really take off. And once again, it just slowly proves that in terms of 4K Plex Media Server playback here, you may need to scale up more from this Celeron and perhaps towards something of an Intel Core processor there, because right now we're not seeing this file being played. And the same's going to go when we go for our final two files, the 200 megabit and the behemoth 400 megabit file there. But again, we're seeing it attempt it, we're seeing it get all the way there. And if we look at my own utilization, we're still not maxing out my local machine, so we're not hitting any kind of bottleneck, even with OBS running there in the background. Ultimately, it's just further proving that this Celeron processor is not going to be good for these tremendously high-end files. And again, less than 1% of you watching this are going to own files of this scale. And for the hell of it, let's have a look at the 400 megabit ultimate file there, that 1.4 gigabyte 30-second file. Of course it was never going to play it. But what we can do is see if conversion was supported. Let's knock it down to a 1080p HD 8 megabits per second version, which is still an enormous job for this to be doing, and it is at least able to convert this file if you're trying to access it remotely. It's by no means countable as playback, but still nonetheless we're able to transcode it. So if you own it, it's not going to stop you watching it, which for many users is going to be just as good for a more affordable NAS system. But this has been the Plex Media Server testing of the QNAP TS-453E. There should be a link in the description to the review, as well as the should you buy and the comparisons for this NAS against many of the contemporaries of the same price point. Again, I will continue this series as long as I can, and if you do find it useful, or you are still in the market to look for a NAS for a Plex Media server as a turnkey solution, then ask me about it in the comments. Or for more accurate, more helpful results, I recommend going to the free advice section where we can answer questions in a first come first serve manner, or use Ask NAS Compares in order to submit your question to the community. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.